long before the headlines of massive civil rights protests and iconic marches filled newspapers. There was a man quietly shaping the course of American history, a man who believed that the law, intelligence, and determination could be more powerful than any march or slogan. That man was Charles Hamilton Houston. Born on September 3, 1895, in the heart of Washington, D.C., Houston entered a world where opportunities for Black Americans were scarce, yet potential ran deep. His parents, William L. Houston, a respected attorney, and Mary Hamilton Houston, a devoted teacher, instilled in him a belief that knowledge could be a weapon for survival, progress, and justice. Education, they taught, was not simply a path to personal success, it was the key to challenging the barriers society placed before him. From an early age, Houston stood out at M Street High School, one of the finest schools for African American students in the country. He was immersed in an environment that nurtured excellence despite a society steeped in segregation. It was here, among passionate teachers and ambitious classmates, that he began to envision a life not confined by prejudice or societal limits. At just 16, Houston took a bold step. He left his hometown for Amherst College in Massachusetts, entering a world entirely unfamiliar and often unwelcoming. As the only black student in his class, he faced isolation and social exclusion, yet he refused to be defined by the narrow expectations of others. Instead, he thrived, graduating magna cum laude in 1915, becoming one of the 6 valedictorians of his class, and earning membership in Phi Beta Kappa. Even in his commencement speech, he channeled the wisdom of the black poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, signaling from the very beginning that his voice and intellect would not be silenced by prejudice. This period of Houston's life was more than academic achievement, it was a crucible that shaped his vision for justice. The challenges he faced, the moments of isolation, and the victories he earned all strengthened his resolve to confront racial inequality, not through anger or confrontation alone, but through careful, strategic, and unwavering use of the law. In the years that followed, Houston returned to Washington to teach at Howard University, influencing young minds and laying the groundwork for what would become a lifelong mission, using legal expertise to dismantle segregation and protect civil rights. But this was only the beginning of a story that would span decades. Courtrooms, and battles against one of the most entrenched systems of racial injustice in American history. If you want to uncover the untold journey of a man whose mind and courage reshaped the landscape of equality in the United States, stay with us. Hit that like button to support the channel. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden heroes of history. And join us as we explore the remarkable life of Charles Hamilton Houston, the man who quietly began the fight that would eventually stop Jim Crow. The journey of Charles Hamilton Houston, from the halls of Amherst College to the battlefields of World War I, was a defining chapter in the life of a man who would come to be known as the architect of the legal dismantling of Jim Crow. After completing his studies with distinction and returning briefly to teach at Howard University, Houston felt the call of duty as the United States entered the Great War in 1917, with courage and a steadfast sense of purpose. He joined the first officer training camp established for African Americans at Fort Des Moines, earning his commission as a first lieutenant. It was a remarkable achievement in a country that often refused black men the recognition they deserved. But for Houston, it was both an opportunity and a chance to serve a nation that had systematically limited his freedoms. When Houston arrived in France, he encountered the harsh reality of a world that spoke of liberty and justice abroad but denied it at home. The U.S. Army, like much of American society, was rigidly segregated, and Houston quickly discovered that uniform did not grant him immunity from prejudice. Officers and soldiers alike treated him and his fellow black officers with disdain. questioning their competence and their right to serve. In the midst of the chaos of war, a seemingly simple act of conversation with a white French woman provoked violent hostility from American soldiers, who threatened Houston's life, a stark reminder that the color of his skin overshadowed his courage, service, and skill. This experience, terrifying and bewildering, crystallized a hard truth. The enemy of equality was not confined to distant trenches or foreign lines. It was embedded within the very society he had pledged to defend. Every day in the segregated army reinforced Houston's awareness of systemic injustice. He witnessed black soldiers relegated to menial labor, denied promotions, and subjected to humiliation, while their contributions were minimized or erased. These inequities were not abstract concepts, they were lived realities that tested Houston's resilience, sharpened his intellect, and deepened his understanding of the mechanisms of oppression. He saw that courage alone could not dismantle prejudice. A strategic, disciplined approach was essential. The battlefield became a forge where his moral resolve was tempered, where the contours of a lifelong mission to combat racial injustice through law began to take shape. Returning home in 1919, Houston confronted a nation still ablaze with racial violence, a country entering the period of the Red Summer, during which black veterans were attacked simply for asserting their dignity while wearing the uniform of the nation they had served. The juxtaposition of his loyalty and the country's betrayal left an indelible mark. Houston understood that the struggle for justice would not be fought on battlefields but in classrooms, courtrooms, and communities, where intellect, evidence, and strategy could challenge the entrenched structures of racial inequality. He had seen the raw power of institutionalized racism firsthand, and it fueled an unshakable determination to create change through law, rather than relying solely on protest or confrontation. Houston's experiences in France also provided him with a broader perspective on the contradictions of American society, observing the respect and courtesy extended by French civilians, contrasted with the disdain he faced from his fellow American soldiers, underscored the artificial and constructed nature of racial hierarchies. It became clear to him that segregation and discrimination were not inevitable or natural. They were legally sanctioned, socially reinforced systems that could be dismantled with knowledge, precision, and relentless advocacy. Every indignity, every threat, and every moment of exclusion served as a lesson, teaching him the importance of preparation, strategic thinking, and the ability to anticipate resistance when challenging deeply rooted injustice. This period of his life also strengthened Houston's empathy and commitment to those who could not defend themselves. Witnessing the struggles of ordinary black soldiers and realizing that valor and merit offered no protection against systemic prejudice, he developed a profound sense of responsibility. It was not enough to succeed personally. He understood that his skills and intellect carried an obligation to challenge the structural inequities that limited opportunity and perpetuated oppression. The seeds of his later work at Howard University and with the NAP were sown here, in the trenches, mess halls, and barracks of a segregated military, where he learned that change required meticulous planning, disciplined execution, and unwavering moral courage. By the time he returned to civilian life, Houston carried with him the clarity of purpose that would define his career. He had witnessed the consequences of a society unwilling to honor its principles of equality, and he had internalized the lesson that the law could serve as both a shield and a weapon in the struggle for justice. The battlefield had revealed the limits of bravery in the absence of structural change, and it was this revelation that transformed Houston's approach. He would fight not only for individual cases of injustice but for systemic reform, leveraging legal expertise to challenge segregation at its roots. The crucible of World War I, with its stark contrasts between ideals and reality, imbued Houston with the vision and resolve that would guide his future endeavors. It was here that the intellectual rigor he had honed at Amherst College met the moral urgency forged in the heat of conflict. These experiences created a roadmap for a life dedicated to dismantling the structures of racial oppression through law, a path that would ultimately empower generations of black lawyers, challenge Jim Crow from within the courts, and leave a legacy of justice that reverberates to this day. Houston emerged from the war not as a man embittered by injustice, but as a strategist, a visionary, and a relentless advocate who understood that lasting change required both courage and method. The trials he faced in uniform became the foundation for a lifelong campaign against inequality. A campaign waged not with guns or slogans, but with the precision of legal argument, the clarity of evidence, and an unshakable belief in the transformative power of law. In these early, harrowing years, the quiet revolution that would dismantle Jim Crow began to take root in the mind of Charles Hamilton Houston, shaped by adversity, sharpened by experience, and driven by an unwavering commitment to justice. After returning from the harrowing experiences of World War I, Charles Hamilton Houston carried with him a profound understanding of the systemic barriers faced by African Americans, not only on the battlefield but across every facet of American society. It was this awareness, coupled with an unyielding determination to fight injustice, that propelled him to pursue the highest echelons of legal education at Harvard Law School, a stage that would define both his intellectual development and his lifelong mission. Entering Harvard at a time when black students were still rare and often scrutinized more harshly than their peers, Houston faced an environment that demanded not only excellence, but a kind of resilience that transcended ordinary ambition. Every lecture, every legal brief, and every examination became a proving ground, not merely for academic achievement, but for the affirmation of his very right to exist and excel in spaces from which people like him were routinely excluded. At Harvard, Houston quickly distinguished himself with a combination of rigorous intellect and strategic insight. His ascent to becoming the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review was not only a personal triumph, but a symbolic breakthrough, challenging the assumptions of a legal establishment that had long underestimated the capabilities of African Americans. Editing the prestigious journal demanded meticulous attention to argument, clarity of thought, and the ability to navigate the expectations of faculty and peers who often carried their own biases. Houston embraced the responsibility with a blend of humility and ambition, understanding that every decision, every editorial choice, and every contribution to the discourse of law was a demonstration that black lawyers could operate at the highest level of professional excellence. The Law Review became more than an academic platform. It became a proving ground for the broader argument that merit and intellect could not be confined by the color of one's skin. Throughout his time at Harvard, Houston cultivated a philosophy that would guide every facet of his career. Black lawyers could not merely participate in the legal system. They had to excel beyond ordinary standards to dismantle the structures of racial injustice. Mediocrity, he understood, would be weaponized against them, reinforcing the prejudices that sought to maintain inequality. Every case of discrimination he had witnessed during the war, every threat to his life, every affront to his dignity, all these experiences coalesced into a rigorous understanding that the law was both a battlefield and a tool. Excellence was a form of resistance. Mastery of the law was both shield and sword, capable of defending the vulnerable and challenging the foundations of segregation. Houston immersed himself in case law, constitutional theory, and the nuances of procedural strategy, recognizing that the ultimate battle against Jim Crow would not be won through rhetoric alone, but through precision, preparation, and an unwavering command of legal expertise. Harvard also exposed Houston to mentors and intellectual traditions that reinforced his growing vision. He observed the power of precedent, the capacity of well-crafted argument to sway judges, and the importance of building coalitions grounded in shared understanding of justice. He absorbed lessons in strategy and foresight, learning to anticipate counter-arguments and to construct cases with both legal rigor and moral weight. These were not abstract lessons, but a rehearsal for the battles he would wage decades later, when he would transform small, seemingly isolated cases into a coordinated campaign against the entire edifice of legalized segregation. Every principle he mastered, every debate he participated in, and every editorial decision he made were threads in the fabric of a strategy that would one day redefine civil rights law. Beyond academics, Houston's experiences at Harvard crystallized his understanding of responsibility. He recognized that his achievements were not his alone. They carried the potential to inspire, protect, and empower generations of black lawyers who would follow. His position demanded an awareness that excellence could create ripples far beyond personal accolades. He began to envision a future in which the legal profession itself could be harnessed as an instrument of social change, where the skills of trained and disciplined black attorneys would challenge inequality not sporadically but systematically, transforming the judiciary into a force for justice rather than a mechanism of oppression. This understanding shaped his interactions with peers, his mentorship of younger students, and the careful cultivation of networks that would later prove essential in his campaigns against Jim Crow laws. Every late night spent poring over constitutional law, every meticulous annotation of court opinions, and every editorial decision for the Law Review were imbued with a sense of purpose that transcended the immediate task. Houston understood that his journey was inseparable from the broader struggle for civil rights. Harvard was not merely an academic waypoint. It was a crucible where his intellect, strategy, and moral commitment coalesced into a coherent vision for social justice. The lessons learned there, discipline, precision, and the relentless pursuit of excellence, became the blueprint for a career defined by the systematic dismantling of racial barriers and the elevation of legal standards for black lawyers everywhere. By the time he graduated, Houston was no longer simply a student. He was a strategist, a visionary, and a pioneer, fully aware that the challenges ahead would demand both intellectual brilliance and unshakable moral courage. The Harvard law experience had honed his analytical skills, fortified his resolve, and instilled in him a philosophy that excellence was not optional but necessary for the pursuit of justice. It was a preparation not just for legal practice, but for the orchestration of a broader campaign against systemic inequality, where the courtroom would become a stage for change and the law itself a vehicle to realize the promise of equality. In this way, Charles Hamilton Houston emerged from Harvard not only as a distinguished scholar, but as a foundational architect of the legal strategies that would ultimately confront and dismantle the structures of Jim Crow, setting a precedent for courage, intellect, and unyielding commitment to justice that continues to inspire today. After completing his transformative years at Harvard, Charles Hamilton Houston returned to Washington, D.C., carrying not only the weight of his personal achievements, but the vision of a broader mission that had begun to crystallize during his academic journey, to use the law as a systematic instrument for social change. His return to Howard University School of Law was more than a homecoming. It was the beginning of a deliberate campaign to reshape the legal profession and empower a generation of black lawyers to confront the deeply entrenched structures of racial injustice. Appointed as vice dean, Houston assumed a role that would allow him to influence both the minds and the careers of future civil rights leaders. Understanding that individual brilliance alone would not dismantle segregation, but that an organized, strategically minded network of lawyers could. In the halls of Howard, he was not just an educator but a strategist, cultivating a cadre of students who would carry forward his vision with intelligence, courage, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Houston's teaching style was demanding yet profoundly inspiring, rooted in the belief that law was more than a profession. It was a mechanism for justice and a vehicle for societal transformation. He emphasized to his students that mastery of the law required more than knowledge of statutes and precedent. It required strategy, foresight, and a moral clarity that could guide legal action toward tangible change. Case studies were dissected with surgical precision, not merely to understand legal principles, but to extract lessons on how the law could be wielded effectively against discrimination. He challenged his students to see beyond the courtroom, to envision the ripple effects of legal victories, and to anticipate the societal resistance that would inevitably accompany them. Through rigorous mentorship, Houston instilled the understanding that the fight for equality would be long and complex, requiring preparation, unity, and a commitment to excellence that left no room for mediocrity. Among the many students who passed through Howard during his tenure, none would illustrate Houston's influence more profoundly than Thurgood Marshall. Houston recognized in Marshall not just talent, but an unyielding drive and a capacity for strategic thinking that aligned perfectly with his own vision of legal activism. He nurtured Marshall's intellect, shaping his understanding of how legal arguments could challenge systemic oppression and emphasizing the importance of precision, persistence, and strategic patience. Under Houston's mentorship, Marshall learned to approach each case not as an isolated event but as a stepping stone in a broader campaign to dismantle segregation, a philosophy that would later underpin his groundbreaking work with the NAP and, ultimately, his historic tenure on the Supreme Court. In guiding Marshall and others, Houston cultivated a lineage of legal minds equipped to carry forward the struggle for civil rights with both brilliance and moral authority. Houston's work at Howard was not limited to instruction within the classroom. He meticulously built networks of black lawyers, understanding that isolated efforts would be insufficient against the formidable legal and political machinery that upheld segregation. He encouraged his students to form connections, mentor one another, and engage with cases strategically chosen to challenge unjust laws incrementally, laying the groundwork for systemic change. Every lecture, every debate, and every mentorship session was infused with the understanding that they were participating in a larger movement, where the cultivation of intellect and strategy would serve as the foundation for real-world victories. Houston's insistence on excellence and disciplined preparation was not an abstract ideal. It was a practical necessity in a society structured to marginalize black professionals at every turn. In addition to legal strategy, Houston taught the importance of moral courage, resilience, and foresight. He illustrated that victories in courtrooms were only meaningful if they could withstand appeals, societal pushback, and political manipulation. By emphasizing strategic litigation, he imparted the idea that change required patience, planning, and an understanding of law as a chessboard, where each move had consequences beyond the immediate moment. His students absorbed lessons not only in legal argumentation but in leadership, recognizing that they were stepping into roles that would require guiding communities, advocating against entrenched prejudice, and leveraging the law to create broader social impact. This approach transformed Howard from a law school into a crucible for civil rights activism, producing lawyers who were not only technically skilled but strategically minded and morally grounded. The ripple effects of Houston's influence extended far beyond the walls of Howard University. His mentorship shaped a generation of legal minds who carried his philosophy into courts across the United States, confronting discriminatory practices, challenging segregation laws, and crafting arguments that would eventually dismantle the legal foundations of Jim Crow. Houston understood that education alone was insufficient. It had to be paired with action, strategy, and the cultivation of a professional community committed to justice. every student he trained, every network he nurtured, and every lesson he imparted was part of a deliberate, long-term strategy to create a sustainable, coordinated force capable of confronting systemic racism through the law. Through his work as Vice Dean, Houston transformed Howard Law School into more than an institution of learning. He turned it into a laboratory for change, a breeding ground for strategic thought, and a hub for a movement that would reverberate across the nation. The legacy of his mentorship, particularly exemplified through Thurgood Marshall and other students, would demonstrate the power of disciplined legal training, moral clarity, and strategic foresight to achieve systemic change. Houston's influence reminds us that education, when paired with vision and courage, can become an instrument of social transformation, and that the shaping of minds is as consequential as any courtroom victory in the long struggle for justice and equality. In nurturing a generation of lawyers who would go on to challenge and dismantle discriminatory laws, Houston cemented his role not merely as a teacher, but as an architect of a legal revolution that would alter the course of American history. By the time Charles Hamilton Houston assumed the role of special counsel for the NAP, he had already honed an extraordinary understanding of the law as both a shield and a weapon in the struggle against racial injustice, a vision shaped by years of rigorous education, military service, and mentorship at Howard University. Stepping into this position, Houston understood that dismantling segregation would require more than impassioned speeches or isolated legal victories. It demanded a systematic, methodical strategy that targeted the structural weaknesses of the legal system itself. He approached the law not merely as a set of rules to be interpreted, but as a precise instrument to expose inequality, provoke judicial scrutiny, and gradually reshape public policy in ways that could withstand political resistance and societal skepticism. His work with the NAP was thus characterized by meticulous planning, careful documentation, and a profound awareness that every legal action was part of a larger, interconnected campaign to overturn a system built on the so-called separate but equal doctrine. Houston recognized that education, more than any other sphere, was both a symbol and a mechanism of racial inequality, and he strategically directed his legal efforts toward schools and universities where segregation was most starkly codified. He personally supervised teams of lawyers who gathered extensive evidence documenting disparities in funding, facilities, teacher qualifications, and resources between black and white schools, transforming anecdotal complaints into indisputable proof of systemic discrimination. Every case was designed not as an isolated confrontation but as a calculated step toward eroding the legal legitimacy of segregation. Houston understood that incremental victories, when methodically achieved, could build the momentum necessary for a revolutionary challenge, and he meticulously mapped out a legal trajectory that would ultimately converge on the Supreme Court. The brilliance of Houston's approach lay in its combination of intellectual rigor and strategic foresight. He was not content with winning isolated decisions at the local or state level. He envisioned how these victories could be connected, documented, and presented as part of a broader argument demonstrating the inherent inequities of segregation. He guided his young proteges, including the now legendary Thurgood Marshall, in crafting arguments that appealed not only to legal principles but to a sense of moral clarity that transcended regional biases. Houston drilled into them the importance of precision in presenting facts, coherence in legal reasoning, and the necessity of anticipating counterarguments from entrenched political interests that had long resisted racial integration. His insistence on excellence was more than professional discipline. It was a recognition that in a society predisposed to marginalize black voices, only the most compelling, unassailable legal work could prevail. Houston's cases were painstakingly structured to expose the contradictions and failures of separate but equal, a doctrine that, while theoretically neutral, had been used to justify decades of systemic oppression. he amassed a detailed record of disparities, demonstrating that the so-called equality promised under segregation was nothing more than a legal fiction. From dilapidated school buildings and overcrowded classrooms to underpaid and underqualified teachers, every piece of evidence was leveraged to reveal a pattern of institutionalized neglect. Houston trained his team to document these inequalities in a manner that could withstand rigorous scrutiny, understanding that the strength of their legal arguments depended on the credibility and precision of the evidence presented. By turning ordinary statistics and local grievances into a compelling national narrative, Houston transformed legal documentation into a form of advocacy that could not be easily dismissed. The cumulative effect of Houston's work was the creation of a meticulously mapped pathway toward landmark litigation that would challenge the legal foundations of segregation at the highest level. Each victory, each piece of documented inequality, and each carefully argued case contributed to the strategic undermining of the separate but equal doctrine. Houston's work was not flashy, nor was it designed for immediate recognition. It was a long-term campaign that required patience, discipline, and unwavering dedication. Yet beneath the careful planning was an unshakable moral vision, that justice demanded both courage and intellect, that systemic inequality could be exposed and dismantled through the disciplined application of legal strategy, and that generations of Americans could benefit from a more equitable society if the law was wielded with foresight and precision. Houston's legacy through the NAP extended beyond individual courtrooms or legal briefs. He cultivated a culture of strategic litigation, mentoring lawyers who would carry forward his philosophy with the same rigor and moral commitment. His proteges learned not only how to craft compelling arguments, but how to see the law as a dynamic tool capable of reshaping society. By instilling in them the understanding that every case could serve as a building block in a larger campaign, Houston ensured that the fight against segregation was not fragmented but coherent, coordinated, and sustainable. The groundwork he laid ultimately culminated in historic decisions, most notably Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court would declare that segregation in public education was inherently unequal, vindicating decades of painstaking legal strategy and relentless advocacy. What made Houston's work exceptional was the fusion of intellect, strategy, and ethical clarity. He demonstrated that the law could be used not merely to react to injustice, but to anticipate, challenge, and dismantle it. His methodical approach turned education, a sphere so deeply entrenched in social inequality, into a battleground where incremental victories could accumulate into transformative change. Every argument he guided, every piece of evidence he collected, and every young lawyer he mentored contributed to a movement that would redefine American society, proving that thoughtful, disciplined legal action could achieve what rhetoric alone could not. Houston's vision of law as a tool for social justice reshaped the legal landscape, established the framework for civil rights litigation, and cemented his role as a pivotal architect in the struggle to dismantle Jim Crow, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire lawyers, activists, and citizens committed to equality and justice. As the story of Charles Hamilton Houston draws to a close, it becomes impossible not to marvel at the enduring impact of a man whose vision extended far beyond his own lifetime, whose strategic brilliance and moral clarity transformed not only the legal profession but the very fabric of American society. Houston did not live to see the full flowering of the civil rights victories he set in motion. He passed away in 1950, nearly a decade before the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, but his fingerprints were indelibly etched on every triumph that followed. The meticulous planning he devoted to challenging segregation, the deliberate cultivation of a generation of lawyers prepared to wield the law as a tool of justice, and the careful documentation of inequality all combined to create a blueprint for civil rights litigation that would endure for decades. Houston's philosophy that lawyers could and should be social engineers, architects of a more equitable society, became a guiding principle for the NAP and countless legal minds who carried forward his mission. It is important to recognize that Houston's genius was not limited to courtroom victories alone. While cases he personally oversaw brought attention to the injustices of segregation, it was the systematic, long-term approach he cultivated that ensured those victories had lasting power. By training lawyers to think strategically, document meticulously, and appeal not only to the letter of the law but to broader moral and social principles, he created a movement capable of sustained influence. Each case, each argument, each brief prepared under his guidance became part of a mosaic of legal reasoning designed to expose the inherent contradictions of racial segregation. This was a legal strategy rooted in patience, precision, and vision, demonstrating that meaningful social change often requires decades of deliberate, disciplined effort rather than sudden upheaval. Houston understood this better than most, and his legacy is a testament to the power of foresight in the pursuit of justice. The schools that were eventually integrated, the civil rights legislation that reshaped the nation, and the generations of lawyers inspired by his work all bear the imprint of Houston's life and philosophy. He showed that education was not merely an arena for intellectual development, but a critical battlefield for social justice, and that by dismantling barriers in schools, it was possible to begin reshaping the broader structures of inequality. His influence was not abstract or theoretical. It was practical, deeply rooted in the lived experiences of those who suffered under segregation, and expressed through strategies that produced concrete results. From the students who benefited from better funded, integrated classrooms to the communities empowered by legal advocacy, the reach of Houston's work is a living testament to the transformative potential of one individual committed to justice. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Houston's legacy lies in the way he redefined the role of lawyers in society. Rather than seeing legal work as a narrow pursuit of individual cases, he imbued it with a sense of purpose, framing attorneys as agents of social change. He demonstrated that the law, when wielded with intelligence, strategy, and moral clarity, could challenge deeply entrenched systems of oppression and generate enduring societal transformation. This concept of lawyers as social engineers continues to influence civil rights litigation today, reminding us that legal advocacy is most powerful when it is combined with vision, rigor, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Houston's life exemplifies how one person, guided by principle and equipped with skill, can catalyze change that echoes through generations. In celebrating Charles Hamilton Houston, we honor not only the victories he achieved during his lifetime, but also the enduring ripple effects of his work. His life reminds us that social change is rarely the result of a single act. It is the cumulative outcome of persistent effort, strategic thinking, and an unrelenting commitment to justice. By mentoring Thurgood Marshall and countless other lawyers, by meticulously documenting inequalities in education, and by demonstrating how law could serve as a tool for societal transformation, Houston set into motion a movement that reshaped America. His story is a powerful reminder that vision, preparation, and ethical courage are essential ingredients in the pursuit of a fair and just society. As we reflect on Houston's life, it is worth considering how his principles can continue to guide us today. In a world still grappling with inequality and injustice, his insistence on excellence, strategic thinking, and moral clarity remains as relevant as ever. Houston's legacy challenges each of us to consider how our own skills, professions, and actions can contribute to positive social change, to think critically about systemic injustices, and to act deliberately to address them. His life is not just a history lesson. It is a call to action, an invitation to carry forward a tradition of advocacy, courage, and purposeful engagement with the world around us. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and legacy of Charles Hamilton Houston, a man whose vision, intellect, and unwavering dedication to justice transformed the course of American history. If you were inspired by his story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the lives of remarkable figures who shaped the world. By supporting this channel, you help us continue to share stories of courage, vision, and change, reminding us all that the fight for justice is ongoing and that each of us has a role to play in creating a more equitable and compassionate society.